Okay. All right, now we're on page 21. Ready to get moving with the Tower of Babel. We're going to try to move through a few things here. I'll probably skip a couple things as far as some slides, but we won't skip any content in the manual for now. All right, so the Tower of Babel, Genesis 11, 1 through 9. In Genesis 11:1, we have the use of the word language, which is sapah. Literally means lip. They all spoke with one lip, using the same words. Established the unity of mankind in language and territory. And what we're going to see, of course, is when God disturbs the languages, it's going to disturb the unity. It says it came about as they journeyed east. Remember, east. What happened when they left Eden? They went out east. When they left the garden, went out east, and we didn't cover it, but Cain went east of Eden. Now they're going east again. Every time we see them going east in Genesis, they're going away from God, going farther away from God. So it came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Again, in Genesis, east indicated movement away from God's blessing. Genesis 3:24, 4:16, 11:2. Shinar was the area of Babylon in Mesopotamia, what we would think of as modern-day Iraq. In that area, it doesn't necessarily have to be Babel doesn't necessarily have to be right where Babylon is, but in the land of Shinar, it's all the land of Shinar. It says, they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. And so these words would have had special meaning to the Israelites who spent almost 2 centuries making bricks for Egyptian pharaohs. This would remind them of these things. And they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into the heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name." They want to make a reputation for themselves. "Otherwise, we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." So unified humanity sought security and social immortality by human viewpoint. And the human viewpoint is basically arrogant rejection of God and in opposition of God. They wanted to live apart from God and His help. Now what we had seen before in Genesis is after they got off the ark, God said, "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the whole earth." Now they know that that's the command, because it says, "Otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." They know that that's what they're supposed to do, but they're not wanting to do it. So the tower, which was a part of the city, shows man's independent spirit, if you will, trying to make things work apart from God or do things in rebellion against God. The "let us make for ourselves a name," the word is Shem in Hebrew. It relates to the character or reputation of a group or an individual. So there's the sense of making a reputation for us. We want to make a reputation for ourselves. Just hold your finger there and think about that for a moment. When it comes to Genesis 12:2, God says, "And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great." The contrast with Genesis 11 at Babel and Abraham is God's going to make Abraham's reputation, not someone else. And here we have man trying to make his own reputation. In Genesis 11:4d, the fact that they were afraid of being scattered implies that they knew God's command to fill the whole earth. So they knew what they were to do. They didn't want to do it. They wanted to do their own thing. And then in verse 5 it says, "The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built." Now it's not that God had to come down and check out what was happening because He didn't know. It's another one of those ways of which God communicates to us. He applied a human characteristic to Himself by saying He came down to see. In theology, such an attribute is called an anthropopathism and shows God's personal involvement in human history. That's the beauty of this. God's concern. God comes down to check it out. God wants to be personally involved, and He does personally interfere with human history. Matter of fact, the Lord said in verse 6, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language." They have the same lip. They speak the same words. And so the unity of human language resulted in a unity of purpose that violated God's purpose for mankind. And so the Lord points out that their unity in their language. And this is what they began to do. And now nothing which they propose or purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the text suggests that if God hadn't intervened, He could not have completed His plan. When God steps in this way, like we saw in Genesis 3, like we saw in Genesis 6, we see here, when God steps in this way and intervenes personally and directly, it's because His plan is in jeopardy. And when I say in jeopardy, I'm speaking somewhat theoretically. Nothing that God's doing is in jeopardy, but from our perspective, this is why God has to step in and do something. In Genesis 11:7a, the Trinity communicated and decided to spoil the united communication of mankind. It says, come, let us go down, and there confuse the language. So here we have the same God who made man in His own image. Now here the Godhead speaks, and they're going to go down and confuse the languages. By changing man's language, God changed his thoughts about independent self-rule, and thus stopped at least this evil undertaking that's going on right here. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. He confused their language. 7c. This confusion was not a racial confusion, as some think, but rather a confusion of language. People groups are often divided by the language barrier. Not so much by the skin color or things like that, but by the language barrier. And that language barrier still exists, although it's being bridged with computers, interestingly enough. And it's interesting to me that the program that you use is called Babelfish. But anyway, make of that what you want. Genesis 11:8, the confusing of the language resulted in the scattering of the people. And Genesis 10, what we read there, describes the scattering of the nations. We read through parts of that. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. That was God's plan. He had to intervene to get it going, but His plan's always going to go forward. Here's, again, the language. You have hello and all sorts of different languages there. Hello seems to be a word most everybody uses, but they have different sounds to how it's pronounced. And the language barrier continues to be a problem even today. Babel means either gate or God or confusion. The people thought they were the gateway of God, but they were only confused. So you kind of can straddle the fence a little bit on the meaning of the word there. Through this word, God mocked their rebellion, because they did, in putting themselves in the authority position, they were taking the position of God, but they had the wrong idea. And so God confused their language. And when you confuse language, you change thoughts, see. Babel and later Babylonia symbolize organized rebellion against God through their satanic pride and defiance of Him. The I wills of Satan in Isaiah 14, one of the last ones is, I will make myself like the Most High. Satan wants to be God. And those that follow after him are going to be following that same type of prideful arrogance. The scattered nations and language barriers should constantly remind us of the problem produced by sin. It's a constant reminder. And then the New Testament connection. Let's go again to Acts 17 real quick. We read it last time. We won't read as much of it this time. The philosophy of history again. He made from one every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation. Remember, He did this so that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for Him and find Him, though He's not far from each one of us. This again gives God's purpose in establishing the nations of the world, that they might find Him. Interestingly, God in His judgment at Babel did not show grace by providing coverings, a protective mark, or rainbow. All the other times when God intervened, at the fall, coverings. With Cain, he put a protective mark on him. With the flood, he put the rainbow in the sky. After Babel, nothing. Or was there? His grace begins to get manifested differently through a specific people group. It's going to be the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And there's an announcement in Genesis 12 about how he's going to do that. Turn to Galatians 4:4. Paul says, "But when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law." Why? So that He might redeem those who were under the law. Who was all under the law? Everybody. In the sense of it brings sin. That we might receive the adoption as sons. So, there was nothing given there directly in Genesis 11. Mankind has to wait. No grace provision right there directly. Indirectly, though, mankind must wait for the time appointed by God for the Messiah to come. And so in Genesis 4:11, it shows that mankind left to its own devices will unite in rebellion against God. That's what we learn in those chapters. The narrative of Genesis now shifted to God's next steps to provide deliverance through the promised seed. What did you get? Was that there? Deliverance through the promised seed. All right, now we're going to fly through this review. Pretty much kind of just fill in the blanks. I'll make some comments while you're writing, but we need to move, and this is a good area to move so we can get through some things rather quickly. So a quick review of chapters 1 through 11 of Genesis. First 11 chapters of Genesis formed a unit to communicate several basic principles to the nation Israel. First, God is the creator of all things. That's important to set in contrast from the pagan environment, the idolatrous environment in which Israel lived. Israel needed this assurance as they prepared to enter a land filled with pagan worshipers. They're getting ready to go into the land of Canaan where they worship Marduk and Baal and all these other gods. These pagans worshipped gods closely associated with aspect of the creation. Baal was associated with a bull, Marduk with a dragon, Dagon with a fish or grain. I mean, this involved child sacrifice and everything else. You think of it, they were doing it. It's a huge problem. It's going to be a huge temptation for Israel if they don't hold to Creator God. Because God created all things, Israel could be confident in His power against the false Canaanite gods who couldn't create anything. And they're not even real. They're made by man. I love the satire of the prophets. Isaiah says, you build these great idols, and you build them with silver chains. Why does the idol need chains so it doesn't fall over? It's a bad thing when your God falls over. And it's a satire there. It's not a real God if he can fall over. See, that's the whole idea. Man in his rebellion against the Creator, man is in rebellion against the Creator. Man's first rebellion brought judgment on the perfect, orderly creation. Man is in rebellion against the Creator. Adam sinned, and here we are. Israel must understand the consequence of rebellion, especially those related to breaking the Mosaic Law. Israel must understand the consequences of rebellion, especially those related to breaking the Mosaic Law. Israel knew that God promised to bless them if they lived in obedience to the law and punish them if they lived in disobedience. They've been told that, and they're seeing that in these first few chapters. What happens when you obey versus what happens when you disobey. Noah was the example of obedience. Enoch was the example of obedience. Much of the rest of it was disobedience. Israel would learn that faithful obedience to God alleviates the curse of creation. Like with Enoch, he didn't die like all the others did. He walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. They're looking around for Enoch one day, couldn't find him. What happened? God took him. And it's interesting to me, they may have been walking along. God says, why don't you just come on with me to paradise? Interesting thing to find out exactly how he took him and all that. God stepped into human history to hold back man's evil rebellion. God stepped into human history. And he still does that today, but we can't dogmatically say exactly when that's happening. We do know He controls history, and we can look at historical events and see that. But we have to be careful in our own times saying, yes, this is it and this is not, because it takes a little perspective, usually past the event. The flood and the Tower of Babel are examples of God's intervention in human history. The flood and the Tower of Babel are example of God's intervention in human history. Another way in which God intervenes is in the area of the divine institutions. Probably need to move that earlier, but volition, personal responsibility, marriage, one man and one woman with the husband in the position of authority. You have to say it like that today for obvious reasons. Family, parental authority. Let me stop right there. You realize these three were all established before the fall. Personal responsibility, marriage, and family all existed before the fall, although this one didn't come to fruition until after the fall. But the command to be fruitful and multiply was given before the fall, therefore this was established. These things are the original divine institutions. The next ones come along as a result of man's rebellion, like human government. Government, ordained by God, but is a Johnny-come-lately divine institution. It has no business messing with these three. God did not give them authority over these three areas. High time some governments learn that. Nationalism, same thing. It's a Johnny-come-lately divine institution. And it's no internationalism. The only one that can operate with internationalism is going to be Messiah himself. Until he shows up, it's not going to happen. It's interesting that the UN has on its building, turn your plowshare or your swords into plowshares. They take messianic responsibility and give it to themselves. The enemy knows what's supposed to happen, but the enemy wants to be the one to do it. See, it's interesting. All right, continuing with the review. After these events, God involved himself in human history again to call Abraham. What did he call him? Abram at first, and then changed his name to Abraham. The descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are important in human history. Choosing Abraham continued God's historical plan. So the first 11 chapters of Genesis introduce the rest of the book. And it really introduces the rest of the Bible. We know the problem. We know who God is. We know His creation. He's the creator. We know the problem in His creation. And we know the solution that's coming, at least a part of it. The rest of it's going to be unpacked in the rest of the Bible. God the Holy Spirit inspired few words to record the beginning of all things and the first 2,000 years of human history. So where do you get that number 2,000? From the closed genealogies. There are two genealogies in Genesis. One is open with no numbers. The other one is closed with numbers. And it gives you what you need, the time-wise, the time frame, roughly. I mean, you got to give or take a few years here and there just because of the way we date things and the problems with dating things. But not more than that, and not millions for sure, and no more than 10,000 for certain. No more. Genesis 12 begins a detailed account of God's choice of Abraham. This is what we're getting ready to get into. A detailed account of God's choice of Abraham. And through the number of words, God the Holy Spirit indicated that even though the content of Genesis 1 through 11 is important, and it's very important, but for Israel, chapters 12 and forward are more important. Now to us in our day, we think the first 11 chapters are more important. The whole thing is important. Well, what part of the Bible do you want to get rid of? See, what would you choose? You don't. I know sometimes reading through Genesis 10 is not the most uplifting information, or First Chronicles 1 through 9, but it's there for a reason. Now, before we get to Genesis, we need to look at Abraham. We need to look at Job. Job and Abraham are contemporaries, and so in our chart we have Genesis, which is the book of beginnings, and now we have Job, which is the book of undeserved suffering. And so Job and Abraham lived roughly around the same time period. Whether they knew each other or not, I don't know. I think they used to text, but I don't know. All right, Job was a contemporary of Abraham. Now let's go to Job 42 and just look at some evidences of why we would say that. The length of Job's life implies all of this. Job 42:16. After this, Job lived 140 years and saw his sons and his grandsons 4 generations. That's 104 years. How long does Abraham live? 175 years. So they're living at the same basic time span. What happens before the flood, people were living close to 1,000 years. Can you imagine if you had lived for 1,000 years? I mean, you could have come over with the Pilgrims and then invested in, you could have done all sorts of things. I mean, you go all back to the Reformation. I mean, you just keep going back and going back. Imagine living 1,000 years. For that matter now, imagine living 175 years. I mean, this is getting on up there in the length of time and looking back in the history that you go through. And so what happens after the flood is people's lifespan drops dramatically. They're no longer living thousands of years, but in the hundreds, and then it starts moving down to the 70s and the 80s. And so there's something changed in either the environment with after the flood, or a lot of people claim it's caused the water vapor canopy of the atmosphere is separating the waters from the waters, kept out the sun rays that caused the aging process to accelerate. There's a lot of different theories, but something happened that makes a change to where the life expectancy is not near as high as it was before the flood. But the length of life connects us to the same time period as Abraham, as well as some other things. The fact that Job represented his family as a priest puts us definitely before Moses, and so puts us in there in a time period of where Abraham, because he functions as a priest. In Job 1:5 it says, when the days of feasting had completed their cycle, Job would send and consecrate them, rising up early in the morning, them or his children, and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, watch this now, this is a real father right here who understands his children. Perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did continually. So he's offering the family sacrifices on behalf of the family just in case they had committed any sin. He seems to know that they could. In Job 40, verse 2, you have the term Almighty used. Job 40, verse 2, will the fault finder contend with the Almighty? Let him who reproves God answer it. The term Almighty is an ancient name for God and appears 31 times in the book of Job. And it appears a few times in the book of Genesis. And so this connects us to the same basic time period. Now, the book of Job, again, is the book of undeserved suffering. And it is a fascinating book. We don't have time to go through all of it, but I do want to hit on some real quick high points. Now, the first 5 verses tell us who Job is. He is a man that was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. Now, that's the type of evaluation you want to hear about a feller. I hope that'd be the evaluation someone would make of us in here. And this is actually God's evaluation of Job. Now, there was a day in verse 6 when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. For the first time in recorded human history, Satan came before God. This is, have we gotten to that yet? Yeah, verse 6. Job endured tragedy. That's what we're going to get. That's what we're reading about. For the first time in recorded human history, Satan came before God. We know who the serpent, or the power behind the serpent was, but this is the first time we've been introduced to this enemy named Satan. And we see that he has access to the throne room. Now in Ezekiel 28, 12 through 19, we learn that Satan had been the guardian cherub, maybe some special type of angel in the throne room of God. He wears, interestingly enough, you read through his investments that he wears, they're the same jewels that are in the breastplate of the high priest, which may imply that he had some sort of priestly role in the throne room. And Satan, of course, as we noted before in Isaiah 14, his arrogance was in his rebellion against God, and it's described as the I will statements. This is who's coming before the Lord in Job 1:6. So in verse 7, the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth, walking around on it." So Satan roamed the earth looking for someone to devour. We learned that from Peter. In 1 Peter 5:8, that he's roaming the earth looking for someone to devour. And God's going to say, have you thought about devouring Job? Watch this, verse 8. The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Now think about that for a moment. Satan comes before the throne room. God says, "Where you been? What you doing?" We're looking for someone to eat alive. Hey, I got someone for you. And your name comes up. That's what happened to Job. And he didn't know it. This is the idea of irony here. We get the inside scoop. What's going on? Job never knows any of this the whole time. All he knows is he's losing and things are happening to him. But he doesn't know that he's been put forth by God as a test case for Satan to try to eat alive. Watch what happens. Let's just read through it real quick. It says, "For there is no one like him on the earth." What about that? How'd you like that evaluation? For God to say about you, there's no one like him on all the earth. Upright, blameless, fearing God and turning away from evil. That's the same evaluation we saw earlier. And here comes the accuser. Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Of course he is good to you. Have you not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land." Note the accusing nature of Satan here. You say he's blameless, this and that, but you don't know what you're talking about. You're not really a God of love, a God of truth. You know, you catch those accusations. That is the same ones he'd made in the garden. But he says in verse 11, "Put forth your hand now and touch all that he has." Now watch this very carefully. Satan says, "He will surely curse you to your face." This is what Satan says Job will do if God allows these things to happen. Doesn't happen though. He never curses God through all of this. Now he gets in some trouble by thinking he knows what's going on, but he never does what Satan said. Then the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not put forth your hand on him." So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. Now watch this. I mean, this happens really rapidly, and I think we could say Job has a really bad day. It says, "Now on the day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, The oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans attacked and took them. They also slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another also came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another also came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 bands and made a raid on the camels and took them and slew them, the servants, with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." And interesting, there's always one guy escaping here. Why? Let Job know. While he was still speaking, I mean, you get one report. All your oxen are dead. All the servants are dead. All this is dead. And then verse 18, while he was still speaking, another also came and said, "Your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind." Now check that. Fire from heaven and wind. Who controls those things? See? "Behold, a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house. And it fell on the young people, and they died, and I alone have escaped to tell you." Now, my reaction would be probably, I want to talk to you guys alone. What were y'all doing to get out of all this? Especially that last one. But watch what Job does. And when you'd expect, just, what would Satan expect? Curse God. Then Job arose and tore his robe, shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." That is powerful. All these things that have happened to him, and he praises God. He sees God as the source of all things. God recommended Job for testing. Ironically, Job was never made aware of the satanic reason for his suffering. Satan was coming and looking for somebody. God says, "I've got just the man." Verse 9 through 11. Satan is an accuser. He's accusing God. He's accusing Job. Zechariah 3, we'll see him accusing Joshua the high priest in a very similar situation as this. And in verse 12, God submits Job for testing, but he always sets the parameters or the boundaries under which Satan must operate. And I love that. Verse 12 says, "Behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not put forth your hand on him." Do what you want to him, Satan, but you can't touch him. And guess what? Satan didn't touch him. Didn't have the ability to. What God allows, God allows. And what he doesn't allow, not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Satan does not have the ability to make that happen. Well, the first round is over. Verse 22 says, "Through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God." Chapter 2. "Again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to Satan, 'Where have you come from?' And Satan answered, 'The Lord has said, from roaming about, Satan had said, from roaming about on the earth and walking around on it.'" The same thing that happened before. "The Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job?'" Again? I mean, come on, he just lost everything. "For there's no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. And he still holds fast his integrity." I thought you said he was going to curse me if I took everything away. He still, although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause. Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has he will give for his life. However, put forth your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh. He will curse you to your face." Satan's getting a little annoyed about now, turning up the heat a little. So the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your power. Only spare his life. Do whatever you want, but you can't take his life." And Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a potsherd to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. And then his wife said to him, and isn't it interesting, Satan left his wife alive. Wonder if he knew something. Because watch what she says. "Do you still hold fast your integrity?" And God said he had. "Curse God and die." Now check that out. First of all, she has Satan's agenda to curse God. And she knows that by doing so, you could die. I think she's a bit bitter. And she's got a bit. Now she wasn't put forth as the test, though, but Job was. But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips." Now, this is just a powerful, powerful book when you read through Job. And we don't have time to go through the speeches, but Job, his friends come, and Job does well until his friends show up. And they sit together in silence for a while, and then finally Job breaks silence, and friends begin to accuse him. "Hey, Job, you got some hidden sin you hadn't told us about? I mean, God doesn't just let this happen to nobody. You've got to have sinned, done something." And in the process, what happens is Job begins to defend himself. He begins to assume to know why these things have happened. And that's where it gets kind of interesting. In chapter 3, we had Job's first speech. And then in Job 4, chapter 4 through 37, we have the debates between Job and his friends. You have all that there with round 1, round 2, and round 3. You have Job's closing argument. And then you have Elihu's argument. And he actually is going to speak well. God will say so. But now let's go to Job 38, and let's talk about this real quick, just a few things, and then we'll finish this up. After Elihu speaks, God finally breaks silence. Job has lost everything he has, everything, including his health. His wife told him to curse God and die. His best friends come along and say, "Hey, you must be a really bad sinner that we didn't know about." All these different things. And then the Lord comes in verse 1 of 38. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" He was speaking words without any real knowledge to them. "Now gird up your loins like a man." It was like, "Get up, sissy. And I will ask you, and you instruct me, since you know it all is the idea. He even says that later on. God doesn't come along and put his arm around him and say it's going to be all right. He starts slapping him around for assuming to know something he couldn't know. Because he's assuming to have a certain level of omniscience, to know what goes on in the throne room. Now watch what happens. Skip over to verse 1 of chapter 40. This is God's first case. This is Job's answer to the case. We read this earlier. Then the Lord said to Job, will the fault finder contend with the Almighty? Let him who reproves God answer it. Then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am insignificant. What can I reply to you? I lay my hand on my mouth. That's a nice way of saying I'm going to shut up. Once I've spoken, and I will not answer. Even twice, and I will add nothing more. Job's got it. He understands. And here comes round 2. God slaps him around again. Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm and said, now gird up your loins like a man. I will ask you, and you instruct me. And he does it again. Now, skip over to chapter 42. I'm going to read out most of the rest of it. After the second round, then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Hear now, and I will speak. I will ask you, and you will instruct me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I retract, and I repent in dust and ashes. He was willing to be rebuked, willing to recognize that he was wrong in what he was assuming. Now watch what the Lord does now. He never tells him about the satanic inquiry. It came about after the Lord had spoken these words to Job that the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is kindled against you and against your 2 friends, those 3 friends of his that were accusing Job, because you have not spoken to me what is right, as my servant Job has. Watch this now. I love this. Now therefore take for yourselves 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer up burnt offerings for yourselves, and my servant Job will pray for you. You get this now? This is a large investment. They got to go get all these animals and worship. And watch this. Job's going to pray, and then he says, for I will not accept him, so that I may not do with you according to your folly, because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. So they have to go through Job. So Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the